landscape urbanism program. He's Eduardo Rico, and myself, I'm Alfredo Ramirez. We co-direct the program, and what we're going to do now is to show you the structure of the program and basically what we do. So to start with, what is landscape urbanism? Well, in landscape urbanism, what we are interested in is in exploring how techniques, dynamics, and discourses of landscape-based disciplines can be reappropriated to ask fundamental questions about the contemporary city. Also, we explore the ways in which the intersection of physical and social processes and dynamics of territorial formation generate new forms of urban design, governance, and knowledge. In order to do so, we have been, for the past 10 years, more or less, we've been exploring different contexts around the world. We've been in Asia, in China, in India, in Latin America, and the Middle East. And from the last year, and of course, in this one, we are exploring Europe and the conditions that can arise from that continent. So Eduardo will explain the brief.
One of the things that called the attention in the European context is that there is what you could call a legal framework that in a way tries to express the intentions of the European Union with regards to its landscape and its territory. That's called the European Landscape Conventions. It's the sort of like a pan-European, it doesn't reach the level of law. It's a convention signed by most European parties that was trying to define an approach towards landscape and the territories of Europe. It had a certain vocation of being comprehensive, of valuing specificity per se, of valuing the way in which the territory, the landscape, is formed both socially and naturally, not necessarily looking at it from a picturesque side. However, this convention, in a way, was produced finally as a series of policies that were kind of like useful both for agricultural producers, property developers, in a way, leaving out any way or form of meaningful social or spatial production. In a way, the European Landscape Convention was lacking what we would call a design ethos or a design intent, which is what we are trying to, in a way, address with the course, right? We are trying, landscape urbanism is trying to somehow focus on the weakness, on certain aspects of this convention, on certain aspects of the way in which Europe looks at itself, trying to look between the certain utilitarian approach that the European Convention has and the cultural practices of the way in which we fabricate our landscapes. We tend to look at political, social, and natural formations. We tend to explore how they interact, how they intersect, and how they relate to the various agencies and sort of like different levels of governance in Europe. So there is a clear intention or a clear vocation of looking at that intersection between natural and social formation. And in a way, we want to push the course, to push the student to fabricate the idea of an atlas, a statement of how a particular territorial condition in a way can be dealt with, and can we critically inhabit that type of territorial condition that spans across different areas of Europe. So there is this idea of atlas as one of the deliveries that we will discuss as part of the course. As I said, we will explore concepts linked to discipline of cartography, mapping, to figure out how you can position yourselves critically within this sort of larger European-wide framework or concept, always linked to the idea of spatial specificity of a particular territory. We'll get into these ideas later on.
So landscape urbanism is a research by design program. And because of that, we have been evolving the methodology throughout the years. And particularly this year and the previous year, we have been exploring these three elements that you see in the screen. First of all is the idea of territory as the locus of our praxis. What is territory? Secondly, we explore cartography as a medium through represent that territory. And thirdly, we ask the students, and the aim of the master is to produce, as an ultimate outcome, an atlas of those cartographies that represent the territory. So basically, the territory, like what we do and what we ask the students to do as well together with us, is to understand this idea, what is territory and why we use it instead of saying landscape design, architectural design, urban design. We think that territory is a concept that could encompass in a comprehensive way all the dynamics and processes that urban, architectural, and landscape disciplines can bring together. So we understand it as a process of appropriation, which is, makes it an identifiable entity. We also, and it is quite important, that we understand territory as an anthropologized space, which is basically the intersection between the natural milieu and the human action. This is something that it's really relevant, and it provides with our idea of hybrid spaces. And the third one is that it is organized through various agents and forms of control. We will go through this through the whole year. So also we start exploring the concept of territory from what Stuart Eldon defined as a political technology, which basically means that territory is something that can be owned, distributed, mapped, calculated, bordered, and controlled. And within that is our scope as designers within those territories and within the brief that Eduardo just explained. Also, as I mentioned before, we are quite interested in the issue of cartography, especially because at territorial scales, we were looking at a medium, at a tool that could help us to represent specific scenarios, specific ideas. And currently, the cartography is, let's say, going through a crisis, which means basically that it's used only to represent what is existing, but it's not used to represent what it could be. And in that sense, we're interested in the projected capabilities of cartography, which is anyway the way in which it was born. And it's not exactly the way in which it's being used, let's say, for example, through Google Maps, no? In which you can actually really understand what is happening in the whole Earth, no? And see what it's there, but you don't see, but you cannot understand cartography as a projective tool, which is what we are interested in. So what are the drawings, theories, techniques, and documentations through which we think this territorial turn into a design practice? So that's the second element of the program. Also, we ask ourselves through this exploration, how do we operate as designers in the territory, and where does our agency reside? No? And as I mentioned, as a tool for projected alternative territorial formation, how does it put forward an argument throughout the scale? No? Because territory is not only large territorial environments, but it could also go into detailed areas of cities or urbanizations. And finally, is the atlas, which is the collection, or the collection that we will ask the students to produce at the end of the year, of those projective cartographies. So the question is, how do we engage with the tensions existing within the specific conditions of each of the territories that we will be exploring? And how can we extract certain prototypical features that can run across Europe as a whole? No? So that's basically what we are about. So welcome to the Landscape Urbanism program. It's actually 2014-15. And Eduardo will explain the structure of the course.
We'll go now through the way in which the course is structured in terms like more or less starting with more technical, material understanding of how the territories are formed, to then move into the fabrication of an argument, linking that territorial formation with cartography, to finally try to explore how to document the findings at a large scale. But the first bit is what we call territorial formations. It's more geared towards you asking yourselves, why does the territory look the way it does? What are the forces, physical, social, and political forces that form it? and how could we go about as designers modifying, and why would we go about as designers modifying or producing changes in those sort of like larger forces, and therefore in the way in which the landscape appears to us. So can we imagine alternative intersections between physical and social processes and dynamics in the territory? So there's going to be quite a lot of study of both material systems at a larger scale, but also social formations at the scale in which we end up producing our projections. What is the role of our agency as designers taking decisions at that scale at which the territory presents to us, right? Using a series of methodologies that we are going to describe just in five minutes.
Then the second and the third term will be all about the idea of cartogenesis, which is based on what I just explained in terms of cartography, but also with the idea of being the starting point of the project. So basically, there is a tension in between specific and generic conditions that will run across the projects, and we'll try to do that by the exploration of cartography. We will have a couple of seminars and a lecture series in which people, artists, and external guests will come and talk about what they think the future of cartography could be, and from where that could input the projects of the students. So which decisions are applicable to territorial conditions which are rich in specific, generic, and transnationally relevant? Also, how is it that the selection and representation of information across Europe can become a projective tool for territorial conditions? And finally, what are the mechanisms which we can intervene and design across scales and across political boundaries?
The idea is in that the last term, you should be in a position to start documenting both your findings at the smaller scale, but trying to push the idea how those findings can be translated back to those sort of conditions that you've already mapped through Europe. So there's the idea of the fabrication of an atlas, the fabrication of a series of documentations that can challenge the more geographical and just descriptive approach of the Florence Convention, and in a way try to push back the idea of design towards a territorial praxis that says something about how can we deal somehow with the tension between the generic and the specific in the framework that we could call somehow Europe. Just going through the teaching staff, we have Alfredo Ramirez, one of the co-directors, also principal in Ground Lab. We have Clara Loriz, who's a studio master as well from Ground Lab. They both also carry the AAE visiting school in the summer in Bilbao. We have Douglas Spencer, which is a seminar tutor with also extensive experience teaching elsewhere in London, critical theory in relationship to definitely the type of work we're working with. We have Tom Smith. Tom Smith is a completely experienced landscape designer, versed in the delivery of large-scale projects that will bring a certain sense of pragmatics, a certain sense of delivery, of how you produce the type of projects we are going to be discussing and talking about. Gustavo Romanillos, who's going to be technical tutor, introducing GIS, sort of large-scale tools to deal with the entire geography of Europe. Then Giancarlo Torpiano and Vincenzo Reale, both technical tutors dealing with coding. They are both AA graduates working in ARUP. And then myself as a co-director, that I'm also a civil engineer, working also in ARUP and teaching in various universities. We're going to run through the studio structure. Basically, what is it that you're going to literally do when you sit down there in number 37 basement?
Yeah, so the design studio is organized in a 24/7 interaction and feedback section. So that's literally what's going to happen. So I hope you had enjoyed the introductory week in London, because probably you won't see it until next September. No, but there is a series of tools that we use in the program to develop those concepts that we just explained. The first one is we use digital simulations and modeling. Basically, we use them to understand territories. We develop this in conjunction with Giancarlo and Vincenzo, who run Python and other programs like Cesar and Mopla to understand large-scale territories and how they react to different environments, to different elements, etc. So there is also a specific scriptings that students develop in relation to specific landforms, like in this case, dune formations and how they interact with specific obstacles. Gustavo will help also on the development of cartographies with the help of ArcGIS, which is basically the accumulation of different layers and their manipulation to create a number of specific visions, ideas, or arguments on how students can envision Europe in different ways, not in the conventional kind of boundary map that we all know about Europe. Also, as basic tools, we use Rhino and Grasshopper to model those territories, and we actually produced physical models out of those modeling. The development of the program is in both individual and group. Because of the large-scale territories that we deal with, students will work in 2 or 3 combination of teams, and the final development of the thesis will be in groups. So there is a kind of idea of always combining students with different, let's say, multidisciplinary skills. No? So, and finally, there is the term structure that Eduardo just explained, which is the first one about territorial formation, the second one about cartogenesis, and the third one on documentation.
There is part of the skills and also part of the ideas of the course are going to be introduced in workshops, mostly during the first and the second term. There is a workshop on social formations where you are asked to try to understand what are the social structures that inhabit a territory, if they can be called structures. How do they make use of it? What are the conflicts inherent in the way in which they are relating to the form of the territory and the way in which it's used or the way in which is, in a way, left alone? So there's going to be more of an indexing, mapping series of work exercises linked to GIS. These are some of the examples of last year of the By the Book in France, linked as well to the generation of dunes. There is the landscapes formation or the landscapes workshop, where we are going to, in a way, jump into coding the way in which some of these landscapes get literally formed physically. We are going to use, at least as Alfredo was mentioning, definitely we're going to use at least software that simulate the way in which sand dunes move, in which rivers move, push and pull, tidal effects. So these are in a way introduced for the students in a way to learn what's happening, but also to learn how to introduce, how to, in a way, intersect it with different social patterns or social ways of exploiting the landscape. The students are asked later to jump and think how cartography can be a way of fabricating an argument on that intersection between the physical and the social in what we call the cartogenesis workshop that will take more place in the second and actually later on in the third term as well. These are the typical, some of the examples of that intersection between the larger scale, physically and socially.
And then there is a number of seminars that we organize in order to back up the design studio and the workshops. So there are 3 of them. The first one is basically called Core Seminar, in which we explore the basic concepts of the program, territory, cartography, geomorphology, landscape. So there are basic ideas, basic concepts that we explore through a series of seminars throughout the first term and the second term. Then there is a lecture series which will start in a couple of weeks, in which we have invited geomorphologists, from some of them from Oxford University, Some others are engineers working in Arup. So people that basically explain, understand, and kind of facilitate the knowledge to the students to understand landforms, land formations from a geomorphological point of view. And then we have a series of history and theory seminars, which I'm going to ask Douglas to explain by himself.
Hi. Right, so we have 2 terms, 2 seminars, broadly on history and theory. The first of these is landscape urbanism and social formation, models, methods, and histories. It's quite a challenge to think about history of landscape urbanism, because even if you can call it a discipline, it doesn't really emerge until about sort of 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more. And its own kind of history that it presents is that there's always been a problem in that landscape hasn't really been understood to be, something that can rescue the city from its problems. And I kind of challenge that history, that conventional idea about landscape urbanism and the history of landscape and urbanism, to say that landscape has always been implicated in the urban. That if you look at Cerdà's modernisation of Barcelona, for instance, he's drawing on ideas that had already been developed within agriculture and its infrastructure. If you look at the modernisation of Paris under Haussmann in the 19th century, then that draws in its formal planning extensively from Le Notre, from the formal landscape gardening traditions of the Baroque. So the history I look at is a history of things like infrastructures in terms of how they connect up ideas about landscape, about nature, about ecology, about how people experience the city, about its economy, about its politics, and so forth. So essentially it's a history of the landscape within the urban. The method part of that, models, methods, and history, is concerned with especially the idea of a social formation, and that's taken from Dennis Cosgrove and his book Social Formation in Symbolic Landscape, which the students of this programme will be looking at quite a lot during the course of this year. It's essentially a way of understanding the way in which things like geomorphology are acted upon and act with social agents, the way in which, to study any territory is necessarily to study not only its design, but its relationship with ecological and environmental questions, with questions of society and politics and the like. So there's a methodology there. And the models are various kind of key points within the history of urbanism. I've already mentioned Paris and Barcelona, but we could look at and will do look at post-war Berlin. We can go further back and look at Venice and look at contemporary cases as well. So that's the first term. The second term is cartographies, the rhetorics of mapping. You've heard a lot already about how central cartography is to this programme. Well, in this seminar, what we do is take the opportunity to look at a number of critical writings on cartography that explore, for instance, how it operates as a form of rhetoric. It speaks from a certain position. It tries to tell us something beyond what a territory looks like. Maps can try and persuade us of certain positions and certain perspectives on the world and necessarily exclude other positions and perspectives. So we look at that through critical writings, through looking at examples of maps, through looking at examples of where artists, for instance, have mobilized cartography as a means of kind of critical interrogation of that discipline itself, and to make larger arguments about territories and urban systems and similar phenomena. Okay, thank you.
Just, there is going to be also a seminar on machining landscapes by Tom Smith, more on the fabrication.